Reflections with Marilyn Baker. Brought to you by Torch Trust, the Christian organisation with a vision for people with sight loss.
It's the second Sunday after Easter, so it's my joy to wish you a very happy Easter once again, and a big welcome to you for this edition of Reflections from Torch Trust, the show that focuses on faith and disability in today's world. I'm Marilyn Baker, and it's just wonderful to have your company. Before I tell you about our guest this week, let's begin with a prayer of thanksgiving for the second Sunday after Easter. This is taken from the Church of Scotland's website from a couple of years ago. God of bountiful blessing, we thank you for the promise of Jesus Christ, who is the life by which we live, and the perfection of your holy glory. We thank you for the faith to believe that which we have not seen, and for your mercy upon us as we clumsily grasp the significance of your love. We thank you for your sustaining strength as we try to lead lives which reflect your glory, and for your ever-present Spirit as our guide, helper, and advocate. With thankful hearts, we give you praise. Amen. It's time now to hear from this week's guest, the Archdeacon of Knowsley and Sefton, who's chatting with Torch Trust's Chris Byland.
We're delighted to welcome to Reflections this week the Archdeacon Pete Spiers. Pete, firstly, happy Easter to you.
Thank you very much.
And thanks so much for making the time to join us on Reflections. Now, here on Reflections, we explore faith and disability in a number of ways. We'll touch on your faith in just a few minutes, if that's okay. So I'd like to start by asking you about the condition you were born with. Just talk us through what it is.
So I was born affected by thalidomide, which was a drug that was given in the late 50s, early 60s to many mums as a treatment for morning sickness. And what they didn't realize was that it had an effect on the unborn baby. So a lot of people died soon after they were born or they were miscarriaged, but about half of us survived. We think about 2,000 were born in the UK altogether. The way it's affected me is that I've got short arms. I have a prosthetic limb on my right leg, and my left foot was turned inwards.
Living with that must be fairly tricky. I guess from the outside looking in, it must be quite difficult to live in that way.
Well, I think what's interesting is that I've never known anything different. So what I'm living with, I've always lived with it. I sometimes look at people who have an accident and become disabled, and I feel it must be more difficult for them, or for people who were born with sight and then can no longer see, or people who have hearing loss and can no longer hear. But for me, I've not known anything different. So in some senses, it's made it easier. So I've had 64 years of living as I have been. And inevitably, anyone with a disability knows they find a way to make it work. So I guess that's what's happened.
Yeah. I read an article a number of years ago about you considering yourself as not being disabled, despite from the outside looking in, that's what someone maybe rightly or wrongly may judge you as. So when you talk about yourself and your condition, how do you identify?
So I think, thankfully, we've heard a lot in recent years about inclusion and diversity. And I'm proud to be part of a church that wants to become younger and more diverse. And so it's valuing the contributions that everyone has to make. Now, ironically for me, the more people talk about disability, the more I feel a bit vulnerable. Because for most of my life, I've tried to blend in. I've tried to keep up with everybody else, just do, not make a big show and not make a big fuss. I think inside, as a person, I feel a normal human being. But from outside, when people look at me and when they first meet me, there could be a bit of a reaction. And certainly shaking hands with people for the first time is always a bit of a challenge as to how people are going to react to that. Interestingly, people will say things to me like, "Oh, we don't see you as disabled." And I'm really interested by that because I'm not quite sure what they're saying. I think they mean it as a compliment, but I am disabled. I am obviously disabled. They may not notice my prosthetic limb, but they can see my arms. And I think there's just the way I am with it means that people don't notice it. I'm just really interested by people's reactions.
Do you find yourself having to explain it quite a lot to people who meet you for the first time to get around some of that awkwardness? How do you deal with that?
So it's interesting. Children are the most inquisitive, particularly when I lived and worked in Everton, part of Liverpool. Kids would walk down the street and say, "Hey, look at you," or "What happened to your arms, mister?" And of course, sometimes the adults who were with them would be saying, "No, shush, shush." But the child was just genuine, not seen someone like me before. So why wouldn't they ask the questions? So I'm very happy to answer questions because people need to know. If I go into schools as part of my work, people will say that. And I say I can drive, I can lick my elbow, which not a lot of people can do. But I can't take a selfie, which is probably a good thing because, can't hold the phone far enough away from me. But in adult company, people don't normally ask questions, whether they're too polite or the thing's a bit rude. So, as always, children are able to speak the truth, but I'm very happy to answer questions.
Identity is really quite important, isn't it, for everybody, regardless of however you identify. And I think it leads us quite nicely to talking about your faith. You are, of course, a man of God that holds a fairly high position in the Church of England. You're part of its General Synod as well. But where did that root of your belief in Christ first happen?
My parents were Christians. My dad was a vicar, actually. So I've always been brought up in a Christian home. But I would say that, so I've always gone to church, but I don't think I had a personal faith until I went to university. And when I went in my first year at university, I met a whole load of Christians my age who had a quality of life about them which I just knew I didn't have. And so that started making me ask lots of questions about myself because then I realized that just going to church doesn't give you what these people had. And I can still remember, it was very specific. It was the 3rd of February 1980. I went to an evangelistic talk in my university town, Durham, and I heard a guy talking about the Christian faith and what makes someone a Christian, and that it's someone who responds to the love of Jesus Christ. And I remember thinking, does Jesus love me? What does he mean, Jesus loved me? And I was overwhelmed with a real personal experience of the Lord Jesus Christ. And what I mean by that was I was having a conversation in my head while the guy was talking, because I thought actually as a awkward 18-year-old that no one could love me because I was born with this disability. But actually Jesus was saying, "No, well, I love you, Pete. And I've even saw you in your mother's womb, even before you were born." And there's great words from Psalm 139, "My eyes saw your unformed body." And I thought, wow, that's incredible. He's had that knowledge. He's got that love. And he said, yes. And don't be bitter, Pete. Don't be bitter. If anyone should have been bitter, it should have been me, because I was crucified for doing nothing wrong. And all of this was going on. And he said, and I can use you, Pete, and I will use you. All you need to do is to accept the love that I have for you and believe that I lived and died and rose again for you. So that night, I walked out of the building a different man, and the Christian faith had become very, very personal. That was 44 years ago, and here I am today. It's led me to all the experiences that I've had, but it was a very powerful experience in spite of my disability, as it were. And it just shows that, God can use each one of us, and that's a very important Christian truth.
Yeah, absolutely. So was the driving factor to become a priest and then work your way through the church? Is that something that you ever aimed for originally? Was there something in you that wanted to become a priest?
No, being a vicar was the last thing I wanted to do because my dad had been a vicar.
Hmm.
And for years, I've had people say to me, "Oh, why don't you do what your dad does?" And I said, "No, I don't want to do that." So in fact, it was the other way. And it was towards the end of my time in university when a friend of mine said, "Pete, people keep saying that you ought to explore becoming a priest. So why don't you go and do that? Because the worst that could happen is they could say no, because you've got to go to a selection conference and everything." And to cut a long story short, I ended up going to a selection conference, very relaxed, thinking if it's a yes, then so be it, but it'll probably be a no. And amazingly, it was a yes. And when the church said yes to me, I took that as a real sign that the church could see something in me that perhaps I couldn't, and that I should accept that I got a calling from God. And it didn't take me long to feel very affirmed by that and say, right, well, this is my path. So I just thought I'd be a priest in a parish. I didn't think I'd end up as an archdeacon, but that's all part of the adventure of following Jesus.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, we're post Easter, and this is a particularly wonderful time of year for Christians around the globe as we remember Jesus, who, of course, died on the cross, then rose again 3 days later. There's so much to unpack from the Easter story and to reflect on. But for you, what is it about the story that inspires you the most of Jesus' story? Is there a particular moment that you really like to reflect on?
I really love the fact that it was women that first saw the stone rolled away and first met Jesus in his risen state. I love the fact that the Easter miracle was revealed to people who were, who were not men, who were part, we would say, diversity now. So I love that they were the first witnesses of the resurrection. I think for me also, it's just a great sign of hope that there is nothing in life that can hold us down, hold us back, and that Jesus has, the power that raised Jesus from the dead is available to each and every one of us.
Absolutely. Do you know what I love about the story? And it's a bit of a weird take on it, but bear with me. I love the fact that when people like the soldiers go back and they're surprised that Jesus is not there in the tomb, I love the fact that they are surprised because isn't that what life is supposed to be? It's supposed to be a surprise at every turn.
I agree. I think that in my experience, every day is a bonus and you never know what's going to happen. And so you need to live in the moment and make the most of it. And surprising things happen. Think people change, situations change for good and for bad, and it's just a part of life. But yeah, I people who say that God doesn't have a sense of humor, I would always say, well, look, he's always the God of surprises, to quote a book. It's what makes following Jesus so interesting.
I mentioned, obviously, and we know as Christians that this is a time to celebrate. And it's also an important time to remember that it's not just a time for us, but it is for everyone, Easter, Christians and non Christians alike. And there will be people with and without disabilities who will be listening to us chatting today who have little to no faith at all, and perhaps have been lost at what Easter is all about given the recent celebrations. What would you tell them about Christianity and Jesus today?
Well, first of all, I would encourage people to connect with the story of that first Easter day. And there are, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They each tell the story in a slightly different way. There are common things. They all agree that something happened on that first Easter day. Just to read that story for themselves, but also just to say that the reason why 2000 plus years people are celebrating is because something happened to Jesus on that day, and everybody needs to come up with an answer as to what they think happened as well. And if Jesus has risen from the dead, that changes absolutely everything about life. So it is pretty fundamental to everything. It gives hope. It means that death is not the end, that we can live life now as we should, that there is forgiveness of sins, So it's pretty fundamental. And I would encourage people to not just see it as an interesting thing, but something that I think there was a book that was written many years ago by a lawyer saying evidence that demands a verdict. And it's either true or it's not true. It can't just be something that other people like to believe. I believe it's true, and I would love people to come to the same conclusion as well.
Amazing. Now, some people really struggle to embrace or even know themselves for a number of reasons, and it might not even be a disability which is holding them back. With the experiences you've shared with us today, speaking on your condition, reflecting on Jesus and the Easter story like you did just there, and your career so far, what is it you would say to them about trying to embrace themselves fully?
So I think accepting oneself, embracing oneself, is so different. I think embrace probably has a nicer ring to it because that implies, a warmth and hug. I think it's really important. It's thinking about what you can do rather than what you can't do, because actually the things that you can't do. So in my situation, there are some things I can't do, and I do need to ask other people to help me. And so none of us should ever be completely independent and not need anyone else. So I'm an embodiment of there are some things I can't do. Many people might not realize it. So tie my shoelace up if it comes undone during the day. I can't do it because I physically can't reach. So just asking someone if they can do it. Sometimes strangers in the street is absolutely fine. And people are only too happy to help. And sometimes it leads to a conversation, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think accepting oneself, made in the image of God. I mean, I think this was the other discovery I made, that even someone like me who looks a bit odd and funny, strange, as the children are fond of quote, I am made in the image of God. And you are made in the image of God, Chris, and all our listeners listening, they are made in the image of God. That means they're unique. That means they're precious, that God looks like them. And so just embracing that truth and accepting it is, I believe, the starting point. And not to, and it's a really hard lesson. I don't mind saying that since that day in 1980, part of my journey was accepting myself as being made and uniquely known by God. There have been times when I've struggled with that, but I am who I am. I am not like anyone else. Don't compare myself to other people. So that's what I would say.
Wonderful. Finally, Pete, as we come to a close here today, is there anything listeners can be praying for you at this time, or your family, or your work?
Well, thank you. Yeah, and what's interesting is I'm in that twilight zone. I will be 64 in the summer. And as Church of England priests, you have to retire at 70. So I'm now in that period of thinking, oh, well, shall I retire sooner rather than later? So that's probably a big personal decision. I enjoy my work enormously, but that's the big thing is looming. And then, of course, Church of England priests have to get out of their houses because the house is given as part of the job. So where we would retire to, I have 4 grown-up children. I have got 2 grandchildren now, and so that's very exciting. So it's a lot of personal decisions. In my work, we are doing a massive, I'm very excited, a very exciting change program, but inevitably change is easier for some rather than others. And so we are working really hard to help people with the change that they need to make. So those are probably the 2 big things.
Pete Spiers, Archdeacon of Knowsley and Sefton, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Our many thanks once again to Pete for sharing his journey of faith, talking about his condition and reflecting on Easter too. Well, that's just about all for this week. If you want to find out more about the Torch Trust and the work it's doing to support people with sight loss across the UK, you can call the team on 01858 438 260, and they'll be only too happy to help in any way that they can, whether that's just helping to find Bible resources, audio, braille, or just some more information about sight-loss-friendly churches, also about our special groups we run, and our holidays together, well, just give them a call. That number once more is 01858 438 260. From me, Marilyn Baker, and all of us here at Torch Trust, God bless.
Reflections from Torch Trust.